They say home is supposed to be your safe place, but what happens when the very people meant to protect your neighborhood turn it into a nightmare? One homeowner thought they were just dealing with an annoying neighbor and a petty HOA rule. But soon, what started as small, almost laughable harassment spiraled into a battle of pride, power, and revenge. And when the homeowner finally decided to fight back, they set a trap so clever, so unexpected, it left the entire community stunned. Would you have done the same, or walked away before it went this far? At first glance, the neighborhood seemed perfect. Rows of neatly trimmed lawns, houses painted in muted tones approved by the board, and an air of quiet predictability that drew families to settle there. For most people, it was the kind of place where you could feel safe letting your kids ride their bikes, where neighbors waved as they passed, and where rules were supposed to keep everything in order. For the homeowner, it had started as a dream come true. After years of saving and planning, they had finally moved into a place where they imagined building lasting memories. They weren't looking for trouble. They worked hard, paid their dues, and tried to be respectful to everyone around them. But in neighborhoods governed by strict homeowners associations, even small things can spark tension. It's not always the big disputes that lead to chaos. Sometimes it's the smallest, pettiest rules that carry the biggest consequences. At first, life moved smoothly. Days began with quiet walks to the mailbox. Weekends meant mowing the lawn and grilling in the backyard, and evenings were spent unwinding in peace. The homeowner felt like they finally belonged to a place that valued order, community, and stability. But beneath that peaceful surface, there were cracks, the kind of cracks you don't notice until they've already started to spread. There were whispers of neighbors fined for leaving holiday decorations up a day too long, warnings issued for a garden bed that didn't match the board's landscaping standards, even rumors of people threatened with liens over minor infractions. To some, these stories were exaggerated tales that circulated at block parties. To others, they were a reminder that the HOA's power wasn't just about keeping things tidy, it was about control. At first, the trash can seem like a minor inconvenience. The homeowner had always kept it tucked neatly to the side of the driveway, out of sight from the street, in a spot where it was easy to roll out on collection days. It was practical, it was tidy, and nobody had ever complained. At least, not until the HOA sent their first letter. It arrived in a plain envelope, the kind that carried bills or junk mail, but the words inside carried a weight that felt anything but ordinary. Violation notice. Improper storage of waste container. According to the board, the trash can was visible from the street and therefore in violation of community standards. The punishment? A warning, followed by the threat of fines if the issue wasn't corrected. The homeowner laughed it off at first. Surely this was a mistake, or perhaps some overzealous board member trying to enforce a forgotten line in the handbook. After all, dozens of houses in the neighborhood had trash cans sitting in plain sight. Why target theirs? Still, not wanting to stir trouble, they rolled the can a few feet farther back, hoping that would satisfy the HOA. But a week later, another letter arrived. This one wasn't a warning, it was a fine, and it wasn't small. The board claimed the can was still improperly stored and slapped the homeowner with a penalty that stung far more than it should have. That's when things began to spiral. The homeowner tried to reason with the board, sending polite emails and attending meetings, pointing out that other neighbors had trash cans in similar spots without consequence. But every attempt was met with the same cold, dismissive response. Rules are rules. The HOA claimed they had the authority to enforce compliance, and if the homeowner disagreed, they were free to seek legal recourse, a laughable suggestion given the cost and time it would take. The absurdity didn't stop there. Soon, the HOA began photographing the trash can, sending evidence of its placement with each violation notice. Some photos looked like they'd been taken at odd hours, early in the morning, late at night, as if someone were deliberately lurking, waiting for an opportunity to catch the homeowner off guard. It was unsettling, invasive, and it felt personal. Neighbors began to notice, too. A few quietly expressed sympathy, sharing stories of their own petty run-ins with the board. fines for mailboxes that weren't painted the exact right shade, citations for garden tools left leaning against a shed, even penalties for leaving kids' bikes in the driveway overnight. These weren't rules meant to protect property values. They were rules designed to exert control. And yet, when it came to the trash can, the HOA seemed particularly relentless. It was as if the board, or perhaps one individual within it, had singled out the homeowner as a target. Each week brought new letters, new fines, and new threats of escalating action. The total penalties began to climb into the hundreds, then thousands of dollars. But the most infuriating part wasn't the money. It was the principle. The unfairness was almost too much to believe. How could something so trivial spiral into a threat against their very home? Friends and family urged the homeowner to fight back, to lawyer up, to take the HOA to court. But legal battles were expensive, draining, and uncertain. The board had resources, experience, and the law, or at least their interpretation of it, on their side. Still, the homeowner refused to give in. They knew that backing down would only encourage more harassment, not just for them, but for anyone else who dared to challenge the board's authority. Something had to change. So, they began to think differently. Instead of reacting to every letter, every fine, every threat, they started looking for a way to turn the tables. If the HOA wanted to play games, then perhaps it was time to play smarter. And it was here, in the quiet frustration of sleepless nights and endless paperwork, that an idea began to form. Not a reckless act of defiance, but a calculated plan. Something the HOA would never see coming. The homeowner would set a trap, one that exposed the pettiness of the board for everyone to see. One that would make the community question whether the people in charge were truly protecting their neighborhood or simply feeding their own egos. The setup was simple, almost laughably so, but the results? They would be nothing short of explosive. The breaking point came on a warm Saturday afternoon, when the HOA scheduled their monthly community meeting. These gatherings were usually dull affairs, discussions about landscaping budgets, holiday decoration guidelines, or reminders to keep noise levels down. But this time, the homeowner arrived with a quiet determination. They weren't just there to listen. They were there to strike back. In the weeks leading up to the meeting, they had prepared carefully. Every fine, every threatening letter, every photograph of the so-called improperly stored trash can have been cataloged and copied. More importantly, they had started documenting what the HOA refused to acknowledge: the dozens of other homes in the neighborhood with trash cans visible from the street. The evidence was undeniable. Clear photos of neighbors' bins left in plain sight, untouched and unpunished, while theirs have been targeted again and again. When the floor opened for resident concerns, the homeowner stood, holding a thick binder. The room quieted as they began to speak, calmly at first, then with a steady conviction that carried across the room. They explained how the HOA had harassed them for months, weaponizing an insignificant rule to issue escalating fines, threats of liens, and personal intimidation. Then came the moment that shifted everything. They pulled out the photographs. One by one, they laid them out on the table in front of the board. House after house, driveway after driveway, trash cans sitting openly in plain sight. Neighbors leaned forward, whispering among themselves, recognizing their own homes in the stack. The hypocrisy was undeniable. The board members shifted uncomfortably. Some tried to interject, insisting the rules were applied fairly. But the homeowner didn't back down. They read excerpts from the HOA's own letters, highlighting the contradictions. They showed time-stamped photos of their own being moved behind a garage, only for new fines to arrive anyway. They even revealed copies of emails where they had politely asked for clarification, only to be brushed aside. The homeowner revealed that they had installed a small motion-activated camera near their driveway. What captured wasn't just the trash can. It was a board member, the very one who had signed most of the violation notices, sneaking onto their property late at night, photographing the bin from angles that made it appear more visible than it really was. The gasps from the audience filled the room. It wasn't enforcement. It was harassment. The board scrambled, voices overlapping in a desperate attempt to explain. But it was too late. The neighbors weren't buying it. Murmurs grew louder, accusations flying. People who had once stayed silent now began sharing their own stories. The arbitrary fines, the intimidation, the sense that the board wielded power not for fairness, but for control. The homeowner stood silently for a moment, letting the chaos unfold. They didn't need to shout or argue. The evidence spoke louder than any words ever could. Finally, when the room reached its boiling point, they delivered the final blow, a prepared statement of intent to pursue legal action for harassment, selective enforcement, and violation of property rights. The board, once smug and untouchable, now sat in stunned silence, cornered by their own arrogance. Neighbors applauded. Some cheered. Others simply sat in shock, realizing the people they had trusted to protect their community had been abusing their power all along. The balance of control had shifted in an instant, and the HOA knew it. The meeting may have ended, but the ripple effects spread far beyond that room. What had started as a quiet battle over a single trash can had exploded into something bigger, a reckoning for the entire community. In the days that followed, the neighborhood buzzed with conversation. Neighbors who had once whispered in fear now spoke openly about their frustration with the board. People who had quietly paid their fines without protest began to question whether those charges had ever been legitimate. The illusion of the HOA's untouchable authority had been shattered, and the cracks grew wider with every passing day. The board tried to recover. They sent out carefully worded emails reminding residents of the importance of unity and claiming that the rules had always been applied fairly. But no one was convinced anymore. Too many had seen the photographs, the timestamps, the undeniable proof that enforcement wasn't about protecting the community. It was about control. Worse still, they had seen the camera footage. The sight of a board member sneaking onto private property under the cover of night had struck a nerve. If they could do that to one homeowner, what else might they be doing behind closed doors? Some neighbors demanded accountability immediately. A petition began circulating, calling for the resignation of the board members involved. Within a week, signatures filled the page, far more than the minimum required to force a special election. For the first time in years, the HOA was facing real opposition from the very people it was supposed to represent. The homeowner, though, wasn't satisfied with just a change in leadership. They had endured months of harassment, thousands of dollars in fines, and threats against the very home they had worked so hard to build. Letting it all slide would mean the board had won, even in defeat. So they took the next step. As for the homeowner, the victory was bittersweet. The stress had taken its toll. There had been nights of sleepless worry, moments of doubt, and stretches where it felt easier to give up than keep fighting. But in the end, they had stood their ground. They hadn't just defended themselves. They had defended the idea that home ownership should be about living, not about living in fear of constant harassment. And the trash can? It still sat in its usual spot by the driveway. Only now, no one dared to complain. Over time, life in the neighborhood began to settle into something that felt almost normal again. Kids played in the streets without parents worrying about citations for chalk drawings. Neighbors left bikes in their driveways without fear of fines. Gardens bloomed with a little more individuality. The rules hadn't disappeared, but they were enforced with reason instead of obsession. The community, once ruled by intimidation, began to feel like a community again. Looking back, the homeowner often reflected on how something so small had spiraled into something so big. A trash can, just a simple, everyday object. But in the hands of a power-hungry HOA, it had become a weapon. And when they chose to fight back, it became something else entirely, a symbol. A reminder that sometimes the smallest things reveal the biggest truths. For anyone listening to this story, the lesson is simple but powerful. Rules are only fair if they're applied equally. Authority is only legitimate if it serves the people it claims to protect. And sometimes, the only way to stand up to unfair power is to shine a light on it for everyone to see. So the next time you hear about an HOA gone too far, or a neighbor who seems more interested in control than community, ask yourself, how much would you put up with before saying enough is enough? Because at the end of the day, the only thing stronger than petty rules and empty threats is the determination of someone who refuses to be silenced. And maybe that's the real takeaway here. You don't always need to break the rules to win. Sometimes, you just need the courage to expose them for what they really are.